I'm Lyle, 32 meters, and I'm embroiled in a family drama I didn't create, but can't escape. It all started with my parents' sudden, unexpected deaths. After the dust settled, I inherited our family home. This wasn't shocking. Their will explicitly named me as the inheritor, considering I was their primary caregiver during their declining health. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Isabella, 29F, was living it up in another city, always the golden child. Her absence hadn't altered her perspective on the world, or, unfortunately, how she interacts with people. Growing up, it was clear Isabella was the favored child, showered with affection while I remained in the shadows. I'm not trying to be bitter, but it's the truth. In their eyes, she was flawless. Even her selfish, manipulative actions were dismissed. I learned to live with it. As adults, we weren't particularly close. Isabella pursued her glamorous finance career in the city, and I stayed close to home, managing family responsibilities. When our parents passed, the will was unambiguous. Assets to Isabella, the house to me. Several months passed, and then Isabella called. Her high-flying lifestyle had apparently crashed back to earth. Too many pricey nights out, and luxury shopping sprees had caught up with her. She needed a place to crash, just for a little while, until she regained her financial footing. It felt off, but I wasn't heartless. She was my sister, after all. I assumed it would be a temporary arrangement, and reluctantly agreed. This, I quickly realized, was my initial misstep. From the moment Isabella moved in, she behaved like the house was hers. There was no attempt at a gradual transition. Within a week, she'd redecorated the living room, replacing some of my belongings with items she'd purchased online. She even had the audacity to move some of my possessions into storage without even bothering to ask. I'd returned from work to find new furniture, all chosen by her, as if she was running the show. She began hosting friends without any prior notice, always at the most inconvenient times. Initially, I overlooked it, thinking her stay would be brief. But each day the situation deteriorated. What truly pushed me to my limit was how she started subtly hinting that we should officially share ownership of the house. She acted as though our sibling bond automatically granted her a 50% stake. Regardless of the will's clear stipulations, she'd drop comments like, "Wouldn't it be fairer if we both had a voice in what happens here?" and would consistently refer to the house as ours, never mine. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. Months drifted by, and her behavior grew increasingly bolder. Elaborate dinner parties for her friends transformed the house into a bustling social hub, and I was simply expected to tolerate it. No asking for permission, no respect for my personal space whatsoever. I'd sit down to unwind after a long day at work, and suddenly, 10 people would materialize in the living room, laughing and drinking as if I were invisible. The final straw came one evening, when I returned from work, to discover that Isabella had changed the locks. Yes, you read that correctly. She didn't even extend the courtesy of informing me. After what felt like an eternity of pounding on the door, I finally gained access, only to find her hosting yet another dinner party. She barely glanced up when I entered, as though I was the intruder in my own home. That was the moment I realized I needed to take action. I confronted her after her guests had departed, struggling to maintain my composure. While a storm of anger raged within me, she acted as if it was a trivial matter, casually suggesting that perhaps I should be the one to move out. According to her, her lifestyle and her friends were simply a better fit for the house. Can you believe the nerve? I was the legal owner, and she was proposing that I vacate the premises. The following morning, I contacted our family lawyer to ensure everything was in order. I had a strong suspicion that Isabella would escalate the situation, and I wanted to be fully prepared. The lawyer confirmed that the house was indeed legally mine, and that Isabella had absolutely no claim to it. He even went so far as to suggest initiating eviction proceedings if the situation showed no signs of improvement. I truly didn't want things to reach that point, but I knew I couldn't continue living under such circumstances. I made one final attempt to resolve the issue amicably. I proposed a compromise. Either she started contributing to the household expenses, or she needed to find alternative accommodations. To my utter astonishment, she laughed in my face. She flatly refused, declaring that she wasn't about to pay rent in what she considered her own house. That's when I delivered an ultimatum. Either she paid up or she moved out. She didn't take it well, storming out of the house in a fit of rage. Proclaiming she was done with me, I briefly entertained the hope that this might be the end of the ordeal. I was mistaken. The next day, a letter arrived from her attorney. She was threatening to sue me, asserting she was entitled to half of the house. I knew her claim was baseless, but I wasn't about to be intimidated. I resolved to fight back if necessary. In the meantime, I began discreetly compiling evidence of her disruptive behavior in the house. That's when karma began to intervene. Update 1. Approximately a week after Isabella's dramatic exit, I received another communication from her lawyer. This one was even more aggressive than the first. They alleged that our shared living arrangement was causing Isabella significant emotional distress, arguing that the situation was utterly untenable. The letter was filled with demands, the primary one being that I vacate the house immediately. The entire affair felt ludicrous, particularly considering the house was legally mine. However, Isabella clearly wasn't going to relinquish her fight. From that point onward, events escalated rapidly. Isabella wasn't content with mere legal threats. She began contacting family members and mutual friends, weaving an entirely different narrative. According to her version of events, I was callously throwing her out onto the streets while she was grappling with financial hardship. She portrayed me as some sort of monstrous villain who refused to assist his own sister in her time of need. It was incredibly frustrating, but I recognized her tactics. She was a master manipulator. The first call came from our aunt, one of Isabella's most ardent supporters. She was livid, demanding to know why I was being so heartless. I explained my side of the story in detail, describing how Isabella had been living rent-free, behaving as though she owned the place, and then had the gall to change the locks on me. My explanation fell on deaf ears. Isabella had already poisoned the well, and in my aunt's mind, I was the sole perpetrator. Unfortunately, my aunt wasn't alone in her condemnation. Other relatives sided with Isabella, invoking the sanctity of family and insisting that I should be helping her, not forcing her to leave. Despite the mounting pressure from my family, I stood firm. Surprisingly, a few mutual friends reached out, offering a different perspective. They informed me that Isabella had been disseminating conflicting accounts of the situation to different people. Some had heard that I was kicking her out, while others were told I was emotionally abusive. A few even believed I had somehow swindled her out of her rightful share of the inheritance. The lies were accumulating, and thankfully, some people were beginning to see through the deception. A couple of friends even offered their support, expressing their understanding of Isabella's true nature. Behind the scenes, I was working closely with my lawyer to prepare for what seemed like an inevitable court battle. I had meticulously assembled all the necessary documentation, proof of ownership, the will itself, and records of all the renovations and upgrades I had personally funded for the house. My lawyer reassured me that I was in a strong legal position. Nevertheless, it was difficult to comprehend how far the situation had spiraled out of control. Eventually, my lawyer advised me to proceed with filing for a formal eviction. I hadn't wanted it to come to this, but at that juncture, I saw no other viable option. Isabella clearly wasn't going to leave of her own accord, and the longer she remained in the house, the more unbearable the situation became. Reluctantly, I agreed to initiate the eviction process. That's when Isabella decided to take the matter public. She launched a full-blown social media campaign, casting herself as the victim of my supposed cruelty. She posted lengthy dramatic updates about how her brother was callously evicting her while she was struggling, portraying herself as the innocent party. The comment sections beneath her posts were a chaotic mess, overflowing with expressions of sympathy and offers of support. It was infuriating, but I refrained from engaging. I knew that responding would only exacerbate the situation, and besides, I had more pressing matters to attend to. At home, things continued to deteriorate. Isabella, clearly feeling the pressure, resorted to increasingly disruptive behavior. She blasted loud music at all hours of the night, left dirty dishes strewn everywhere, and deliberately created messes in the shared spaces. It seemed as though she was intentionally trying to provoke a reaction from me. However, I refused to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I meticulously documented every instance of her misconduct. I took photographs, maintained a detailed log of her behavior, and ensured I had ample evidence to present in court if necessary. Her behavior wasn't limited to noise and mess-making. She began inviting increasing numbers of people over, effectively transforming the house into a private social club. There were nights when I would return home to find the living room teeming with complete strangers, all behaving as though they had every right to be there. Once again, I documented everything, knowing that it would bolster my case. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Isabella made an unexpected proposition. She informed me that if I provided her with a lump sum of cash, she would leave the house for good. She claimed she was weary of the drama and simply wanted what she believed she deserved. The sheer audacity of her request was unbelievable. I wasn't about to cave into her demands, especially knowing that this was likely just another one of her manipulative ploys. I told her that money was absolutely off the table and that I was prepared to see this through the legal system. Shortly after that conversation, we received a court date for the eviction hearing. I experienced a mixture of relief and apprehension, relief that the matter was finally progressing, but also dread because I knew Isabella wouldn't surrender without a fight. And that's when her behavior took a peculiar turn. She suddenly became excessively sweet, almost to a disturbing degree. She started cleaning the house, doing the dishes, and even prepared dinner for me one evening. It was as though she'd undergone a complete personality transformation. But I wasn't fooled. I knew she was up to something. My suspicions were confirmed when a friend of mine who worked in finance provided me with some inside information. Isabella's financial situation was even more precarious than I'd imagined. She was on the verge of bankruptcy and desperately needed the house to maintain a semblance of her former lifestyle. She was feigning kindness because she believed it might buy her more time. I didn't reveal that I was aware of her predicament. I remained silent, played along, and waited for the court date. It felt as though karma was finally catching up with Isabella, but I had a sneaking suspicion that this was only the beginning of her downfall. Update 2. As the eviction hearing drew nearer, Isabella showed no signs of backing down. In fact, she doubled down on her social media persona. Every other day, she posted long, dramatic updates about her supposedly imminent homelessness, painting herself as the victim, and me as the cold-hearted brother casting her out onto the streets. It was the same fabricated narrative she'd been feeding to our family and mutual friends, but now it was reaching a much wider audience. People in the comments were lapping it up, offering her places to stay, and even suggesting financial assistance. The outpouring of sympathy was overwhelming. Meanwhile, I remained silent. My lawyer had advised me to avoid engaging in any public drama, and I wasn't about to make things worse by getting into arguments on social media. However, maintaining my silence wasn't easy. I could feel the weight of judgment from people who only knew Isabella's side of the story. Some of our acquaintances started treating me differently, clearly believing her version of events. Still, I kept my head down and focused on preparing for the upcoming court hearing. Out of the blue, I received a message from Troy, an old childhood friend. Troy had dated Isabella years ago, and while we hadn't spoken in a long time, his message took me by surprise. He told me he'd been following the situation from a distance and wanted to give me a heads up. Apparently, Isabella had pulled similar manipulative stunts during their relationship. Troy warned me that she was likely to resort to underhanded tactics in court and offered to testify on my behalf if things got messy. I hadn't expected such an offer, but it was a relief to know someone else saw through her charade. In the meantime, I continued diligently gathering evidence, every loud party, every piece of damaged furniture, every time she refused to contribute to the bills or upkeep. I documented it all. My lawyer assured me that this comprehensive record would help solidify my case in court. I didn't want to leave any room for doubt, especially given how publicly Isabella was playing the victim card. Through some diligent investigation, I uncovered even more details about Isabella's financial situation. It was far worse than I'd initially imagined. She'd maxed out multiple credit cards, was months behind on rent at her previous apartment, and had only moved in with me because she was on the verge of being evicted. She had, of course, conveniently omitted these details from her sob story, simply showing up at my doorstep asking for temporary help, pretending she had everything under control. Learning the extent of her deception only strengthened my resolve to see this through the legal process. As the court date approached, my lawyer walked me through every aspect of the case. We had all the necessary documentation, the will, proof of ownership, and records of all the money I'd spent on maintaining and improving the house. My nerves began to settle, knowing how solid my case was. But just when I thought things were progressing smoothly, Isabella attempted one last manipulative tactic. A few days before the hearing, she approached me, suddenly acting as though she wanted to make amends. She claimed she'd been under a lot of stress and was now ready to settle things privately. She dangled the possibility of moving out voluntarily if I would just give her a few $1,000s to help her land on her feet. It was almost laughable at that point. I calmly informed her that her offer was unacceptable and that we would let the court decide the matter. She didn't take it well, storming off in a huff and warning me that things were about to get much worse. True to her word, she intensified her smear campaign. More family members contacted me, questioning why I was being so cruel to my sister. Isabella even went so far as to tell people that I'd kicked her out of the house when we were children, a complete fabrication. No one had ever heard the story before, but apparently, she was willing to rewrite our entire history to garner sympathy. One afternoon, I ran into Mara, one of Isabella's close friends, at a local cafe. I braced myself for an awkward conversation, expecting more of the same accusations. However, Mara surprised me. She admitted that she was starting to have doubts about Isabella's version of events. She confided that many of their mutual friends were beginning to see through the lies but were hesitant to confront Isabella directly. Mara didn't divulge too many details, but it was clear that Isabella's social circle was beginning to unravel. It was a small victory, but it gave me a glimmer of hope that the truth was finally starting to emerge. With all the information I'd gathered, I walked into the courtroom, feeling more prepared than ever. My lawyer had one last ace up his sleeve: Isabella's bankruptcy filings, which I had obtained through public records. I wasn't certain if she was aware that I possessed this information, but I planned to use it if necessary. The day of the hearing arrived, and Isabella appeared with her lawyer, looking smug and confident. She kept glancing at her phone, clearly updating her friends on the proceedings. I remained silent, allowing my lawyer to handle the legal arguments. The judge reviewed the paperwork efficiently, and it didn't take long for the decision to be announced. The ruling was in my favor. The will, the ownership documents, and the mountain of evidence I'd compiled left no room for doubt. The judge granted the eviction request, giving Isabella 30 days to vacate the premises. Isabella was stunned by the ruling. She had a complete meltdown right outside the courtroom, screaming at me, accusing me of ruining her life, and claiming I'd always been jealous of her. She swore that karma would eventually come for me. I stood there and listened patiently, but I didn't engage. There was nothing left to say. Even though the judge had ruled in my favor, I knew Isabella wasn't going to go quietly. I could sense her desperation. She had 30 days to leave, but something told me she wasn't going to go down without a fight. I had to remain vigilant. There was still time for her to attempt something drastic, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. Update 3. With just 2 weeks remaining before Isabella was legally required to move out, something unexpected occurred. She abruptly ceased all of her aggressive and disruptive behavior. Instead of picking fights with me as she usually did, she became almost eerily polite. She started cleaning the house, preparing meals, and generally acting as if nothing was amiss. She even went out of her way to be overly friendly, which was a massive red flag. I'd been dealing with Isabella long enough to know that this sudden shift in behavior wasn't genuine. She was clearly up to something. My suspicions were confirmed a few days later. I was tidying up the living room when I noticed something odd near one of the bookshelves. At first, I assumed it was just another one of her random knickknacks, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was a hidden camera, strategically positioned to capture virtually everything that transpired in the living room, particularly any interactions between us. That's when it clicked. She was attempting to bait me into doing or saying something that she could use against me in court, presumably to delay the eviction or gain some kind of leverage. I immediately removed the camera and contacted my lawyer. We documented the discovery, taking photographs and ensuring the device was completely disabled. It was yet another layer of complexity added to the already messy situation, but at least we had concrete proof of her underhanded tactics. I wasn't about to let her get away with this. Around the same time, I started receiving information from people within Isabella's social circle. Her friend Mara, who had previously hinted that people were starting to question Isabella's narrative, informed me that several of their mutual friends had stopped associating with her altogether. Apparently, the cracks in her carefully constructed image of perfection were beginning to show. Her entire social media campaign against me had backfired spectacularly. After the court ruling, people were starting to see through her victim act, especially when they realized she hadn't been entirely truthful about the situation. It wasn't just her friends who were turning their backs on her. Isabella's financial situation was rapidly deteriorating. I discovered she had been dodging calls from creditors for weeks, and her car was about to be repossessed. She was sinking fast, but she still hadn't admitted the extent of her problems to anyone. The facade of her successful life was crumbling around her, but instead of facing reality, she was doubling down on her toxic behavior. Then, just days before she was supposed to vacate the premises, things escalated dramatically. I arrived home one afternoon to discover that Isabella had completely trashed the house. Broken furniture was scattered across the living room, graffiti adorned the walls, and torn up photographs of our parents littered the floor. It was a blatant act of revenge, a last-ditch effort to lash out, because she knew her time was up. I immediately began documenting the damage, taking photographs and videos of everything and sending them to my lawyer. We agreed that if she refused to pay for the damages, we would press charges. At this point, I had no sympathy left for her. She had repeatedly crossed the line and made it abundantly clear that she wasn't going to leave without inflicting as much destruction as possible. I confronted her the following day, delivering a final warning. I told her she needed to leave peacefully and pay for the damage she'd caused. She simply laughed in my face. Her exact words were something along the lines of, "There's nothing you can do to me that's worse than what life has already done." She was right about one thing. Her life was falling apart, and there wasn't much I could do to make it worse. But I wasn't about to let her drag me down with her. On the day of the eviction, I had a crew on standby, ready to change the locks the moment she was out. Isabella packed up the few remaining belongings she hadn't already destroyed and stormed out without uttering a word. She didn't attempt to create a scene, which surprised me, but I wasn't going to question it. The moment she was gone, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The house was finally mine again. I changed the locks, cleaned up the mess she'd left behind, and tried to begin the process of moving on. But of course, the saga wasn't quite over. Just when I thought I was finally free of her, I received a letter from a debt collection agency. Isabella had listed me as a co-signer on a substantial personal loan, and she had defaulted on the payments. It was infuriating. I had never co-signed anything for her, and I had no idea how she'd managed to pull off such a stunt. I immediately contacted my lawyer again, and we began working to prove that I had no connection to the loan. It was just another desperate attempt by Isabella to drag me down with her financial collapse. As word spread about her increasingly dire situation, more of her friends came forward with their own stories of her manipulative behavior. Apparently she had been using and manipulating people for money for years. Her social circle was crumbling, leaving her more isolated than ever. Her once glamorous lifestyle was completely falling apart. The final blow came not long after. I received word that Isabella's car had been repossessed, and she had officially filed for bankruptcy. She'd moved into a small, rundown apartment, a far cry from the life of luxury she'd once flaunted. It was a sad ending for someone who had always prided herself on being superior to everyone else. Karma had finally caught up with her. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The house was quiet, and I no longer had to constantly look over my shoulder, worrying about Isabella showing up with some new scheme or attempting to ruin my life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't quite the end of the story. Isabella had a knack for reappearing, when you least expected it, and I had a feeling she wasn't finished yet. Update 4. After the tumultuous eviction and the seemingly endless court battles, I decided it was time to sever all ties with Isabella, completely. I had no desire to have her in my life any longer. After everything that had transpired, it was painfully clear that our relationship was beyond repair. I implemented a no-contact policy immediately, blocking her on all social media platforms and refusing to respond to any texts or calls she attempted to send my way. For the first time in a long while, my life was peaceful. With Isabella finally out of the picture, I could begin focusing on rebuilding both the house and my own life. The damage she had inflicted was more than just physical. The emotional toll of the past year had been immense, but I was determined to move forward. I spent the next few months restoring the house to its former glory, repainting the graffiti-covered walls, replacing the broken furniture, and generally putting things back in order. The newfound tranquility of the house was a welcome change. However, every so often, I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting Isabella to come storming back into my life with some new scheme or manipulative tactic. Despite the peace I had finally achieved in my own home, There was still fallout within the family. Some family members, particularly those who had always favored Isabella, steadfastly refused to believe the extent of her manipulation. They couldn't grasp the concept that she wasn't the innocent victim she portrayed herself to be. This left me feeling isolated from certain segments of my extended family, especially those who continued to support her despite all the evidence to the contrary. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was difficult not to feel hurt by their unwavering loyalty to her. Even after the court rulings and her increasingly outrageous behavior, just when I thought I was finally free from her clutches, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It was from Isabella. I hesitated to open it, but curiosity eventually got the better of me. In the letter, she offered a seemingly heartfelt apology for everything that had happened. She claimed she had hit rock bottom and was genuinely remorseful, expressing a desire to make amends and asking if we could somehow start fresh. On the surface, it sounded sincere, but after everything I'd endured, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another one of her manipulative ploys. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I shared the letter with my lawyer, seeking his advice. He counseled caution, suggesting I take my time before making any decisions. I wasn't sure what her true motives were, and after all that had transpired, I wasn't in any rush to find out. The wounds were still too fresh, and I wasn't about to let her back into my life without a very compelling reason. While I was grappling with this unexpected development, something positive happened. I reconnected with an old friend, Rowan, whom I had known for years. Throughout the entire ordeal with Isabella, Rowan had been a constant source of support. Over time, our friendship deepened into something more. We started dating, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had something positive to look forward to. Rowan helped me regain my footing, and our relationship provided a sense of stability I hadn't realized I was missing. Through this entire process, I came to realize how much I had grown and changed as a result of my experience with Isabella. I was no longer the same passive, accommodating brother who allowed her to walk all over me. I had found my voice, learned to set boundaries, and was fully prepared to protect what was rightfully mine. It hadn't been easy, but I had emerged from the situation stronger and more assertive, something I never would have predicted. Meanwhile, Isabella's life continued its downward spiral. I heard through the grapevine that she had lost her job. Her erratic and increasingly unprofessional behavior at work had finally caught up with her. Without a steady income, she was struggling to make ends meet. While a small part of me felt a pang of pity for her, there was also a sense of satisfaction. Karma had finally caught up with her. She'd spent so long manipulating and exploiting others, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. As for me, I continued to rebuild my relationships with the family members who had supported me throughout the ordeal. I no longer felt the need to defend myself or explain my actions. Those who had stood by me knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. I had weathered the storm and emerged stronger on the other side. The house felt like mine again, and more importantly, my life did too. But just when I thought everything was finally settling down, one last legal hurdle appeared out of nowhere. Isabella attempted to contest the will yet again. This time, she claimed she had been coerced into signing certain documents, implying that our parents had forced her hand. It was a preposterous accusation, but it meant more time and energy spent dealing with legal matters. My lawyer and I swiftly and decisively shut down her baseless claims. We had all the necessary paperwork, and ample proof that her accusations were completely unfounded. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to cause trouble, but it ultimately went nowhere. This proved to be the final straw for Isabella's already crumbling case. She had no legal standing whatsoever, and after this latest failed attempt, I sincerely hoped she would finally give up and move on with her life. With that final legal battle behind me, I felt a profound sense of closure. Isabella's relentless attempts to drag me down had failed, and I was finally ready to move on with my life for good. It had been a long and exhausting process, but I had emerged from it stronger and more resilient than ever before. Isabella was out of my life, and this time, I truly hoped it was for good. Update 5. A few months after the last legal battle concluded, something rather peculiar happened. Isabella vanished. I didn't hear from her at all, which was a welcome change. She also completely disappeared from social media. She had always been so active online, constantly updating her followers on her supposedly glamorous life. But now, there was nothing but silence. Even our family noticed her sudden absence. She had cut off contact with most of them. Word eventually trickled back to me that she had moved to a small town somewhere, presumably to try and start over. As one of our cousins put it, she tucked her tail between her legs and ran. I didn't delve any deeper into her whereabouts. As far as I was concerned, the less I knew about her location, the better. For the first time in a very long time, I finally felt at peace. With Isabella out of the picture, I didn't have to constantly worry about her showing up at my door or pulling some other manipulative stunt. The house was truly mine, and so was my life. I shifted my focus to my career and my blossoming relationship with Rowan, who had been my rock throughout the entire ordeal. It felt good to have something stable in my life, someone who wasn't constantly stirring up drama and chaos. I was rebuilding, and for once, things were calm. The house, however, still felt heavy with the weight of all that had transpired within its walls. No matter how many repairs and renovations I made, I couldn't entirely shake the memories of the turmoil Isabella had caused. Every room held a reminder of the chaos and disruption she had brought into my life. Rowan, Recognizing how much the house was tied to these negative memories suggested something I hadn't previously considered. Perhaps it was time to sell the family home and make a fresh start somewhere new. At first, the idea seemed a bit extreme. This was the house I had grown up in, the house my parents had left me. It held a lot of sentimental value. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The past was a heavy burden, and I was ready to leave it behind. Just as I was beginning to seriously contemplate selling the house, I received an unexpected call. It was a debt collector. I couldn't believe it. This time, it was for a loan Isabella had taken out years ago, long before any of this mess had even started. Somehow, my name had become entangled in it. I didn't waste any time. I immediately forwarded all the details to my lawyer, and within a few days, he had resolved the issue before it could escalate. It was a quick fix, but it served as a stark reminder that even though Isabella had disappeared, her messes could still find a way to reach me. A few months later, Isabella made what I sincerely hoped would be her final attempt at contact. I received one last message from her. She claimed that she had genuinely changed and wanted to make things right between us. She expressed a desire to come back and rebuild our relationship, to start fresh. Perhaps the old me, the more passive and forgiving me, would have considered it, or at least entertained the idea, but after everything I'd been through, I was completely detached from that toxic cycle. I didn't respond. I had no intention of allowing her back into my life, no matter how much she claimed to have changed. With that final message, I made my decision. I was going to sell the house. The memories associated with it were simply too tainted, and I was ready for a complete fresh start. Rowan was incredibly supportive, encouraging me to leave the past behind and embrace a new beginning together. We began searching for a new home, somewhere we could truly build a future of our own. It wasn't an easy decision to sell the family home. It represented my family's legacy. But it had also been the scene of so much pain and conflict. It was time to close that chapter for good. When the house was finally sold, I experienced a profound sense of closure that I hadn't anticipated. Isabella had reaped what she had sown, and now I was free to live my life without the shadow of her toxicity looming over me. No more legal battles, no more manipulations, no more drama. The house was no longer my responsibility, and with that realization, I could fully embrace moving forward with my life. As I closed the door on my old life and prepared to step into my new one, I took a moment to reflect on the entire ordeal. Sometimes, the people closest to us can become the greatest sources of chaos and disruption in our lives, and that had certainly been the case with Isabella. But through all the turmoil and adversity, I had emerged stronger. I had found my voice, learned to stand up for myself, and most importantly, I had learned how to protect my peace and well-being. The experience had profoundly changed me, but in the end, it had forged me into a better version of myself. In my final Reddit post, I informed everyone that I had officially moved into a new home with Rowan and was embarking on a new chapter of my life. I made it clear that I was free from Isabella's toxic influence, and that I wasn't looking back. Karma had done its job. She had faced the consequences of her actions, and I was finally free to live the life I deserved. It's strange how things come full circle. What began as a simple family inheritance had spiraled into one of the most challenging years of my life. But now, standing in my new home with Rowan by my side, I felt a sense of peace and contentment I hadn't experienced in a very long time. The drama, the chaos, the constant turmoil, it was all behind me, and for the first time, I was truly ready to move forward, free from the shackles of the past.